tonight we have Paul Taylor talking about governance. Why is governance so important to running and supporting technology? Paul is a consultant with over 30 years of experience of implementing change across the financial service, oil, gas, charities, and professional bodies. He has written and spoken on a variety of subjects with change management, freelancing, technology, financial services research, approaches, etc. He is Chair and NED for a variety of industry and social enterprise covering gambling, addiction, and performing acts for BAME community. Finally, he is an associate lecturer of the Open University, STEAM School Teaching Technology Management.
So welcome, well, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. So welcome to the presentation on why governance is so important, particularly around the technology side. Let me just try and get the screen scrolling down. Yeah, I mean, Antonio introduced me much better than I could introduce me. So Antonio, if you're ever lost for words, you can always be my PR agent. So I'm always looking for somebody to shamelessly blag me around the world. But I've done a number of these discussions, and I've been working with Antonio and Simon and a few of the other BCS people over about 5 or 6 years now. So I haven't really changed since the last time I spoke, apart from the fact I'm probably about 7 months older, and that's about it really, maybe not 7 months wiser. So sort of diving into the crux of the presentation, I think we wanted to talk about sort of like governance and why it's so important. Governance obviously is often, it gets some very, very bad press for a number of reasons, which we can sort of go through some examples there. But I think with the current world, with all its complexities and unniceties around at the moment, having governance around organisations generally, and particularly around technology elements, is actually now essential. So the way I'm going to try and structure the presentation, or the next hour and a bit, is I'm going to sort of cover it in sort of like six sequential bits, where I'm just going to talk through and probably sort of run through some pretty Janet and John stuff about the complexity of organisations, how this complexity needs to be managed, and therefore why governance is required, and and also talk about what actually is governance, because obviously it gets a lot of bad press, some of it deserved, some of it not deserved, to be fair. And then towards the end, well, actually about halfway through, we'll run through some elements of governance, and at the very end I've pulled together a very, very basic technology governance model which hopefully covers some of the main areas. So it's probably worthwhile sort of running through the complexity of organisations at the moment. I think it's safe to say looking at these careers and CVs, we've all worked across a wide range of different organisations, and we can safely say they're all very complex, lots of interacting parts. Everything from, I mean, at the top point, because obviously it's the BCS, is technology infrastructures. All the technology infrastructures have got hardware, different versions of hardware, software packages, software challenges around version control, software packages that don't speak when they should be speaking, and what have you, issues around cyber security, as well as things like staffing. Businesses are a sort of like a patchwork quilt of processes. Everything that's automated, some are manual processes. Where would we be without spreadsheets? Paper-based process, stuff that's run by email, so severe complexity. Organisations need a massive range of different skill sets to operate. Everything, I mean, again, just across technology, I mean, there's discipline after discipline within technology, and if you think outside technology, you've probably got the same in finance and HR and sales and operations and finance, what have you. Firms are spread across different locations, different floors of different buildings that location can be, which is just as challenging in some cases. They could be in different buildings, they could be in physical different locations, or they could be across border, with outsourcing and offshoring key at the moment. We all run through different jurisdictions. I mean, I've done a lot of work, particularly with financial services over the last 5 or 6 years. There's, if you operate in Ireland, or if you operate in Luxembourg or in the UK, especially post-Brexit, you've got completely different and contradictory regulations on there, which is an absolute nightmare to understand. We have various surprises, and I use the word not nice surprises, that come up that hit us sideways. obviously we're all aware of COVID-19, which still hitting us at the moment. That sort of literally appeared over like 3 weeks in sort of like Q1 last year, and sorry, press one button, and obviously made working changes and increased complexity almost within about a month. SARS, for those who are a little bit older, can remember that about 10 years ago in the Far East. And also, I put down there at the end, also generally there is organisations, as well as all this other stuff they're trying to deal with, they've been forced to go green. Climate change is now a very big, well, it's not a big thing, it's a real thing now. I mean, otherwise there won't be a tomorrow. So this complexity impacts many things across an organisation. Strategic direction is a key area. Why are you make sure organisations are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Impacts, as I mentioned earlier, technology. If you can think about the complexity as a game of Zynga type thing with bricks after bricks piled on top of each other, trying to change that is an absolute nightmare. People need to be looked after. You need to manage suppliers. Suppliers could be managing you. People are also trying to be ethical in their way they operate. You need to grow the business. Operational running a business, whether it's a technology business or technology elements, or just any other business, is an absolute nightmare. You need to look after your clients. And the other one down is being moral, which is strange. I haven't worked in financial services because they're not actually known as the most moral area, but I have worked in charitable organisations, and it's trying to do the right thing, all these different contradictions. And last but not least, round there is going green. So you've got a complex set of businesses, of elements all together that need to be managed going forward. And I think it's safe to say I've been around in the industry since in the 80s, where organisations are getting more and more complex as over the years. I just can't see that changing at all. This could be triggered by new legislation and regulation. I mean, we've obviously got the old infamous health and safety many years ago that came in for very good reasons. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working in financial services, and they have a thing called senior management and certification regime. For those who don't know what that is effectively putting a named person to be responsible for certain parts of the business. And that person, if that part of the business fails, is subject to criminal prosecutions. So it's actually making individuals really liable for their own bits of work. And other areas, accounting standards are constantly changing. And external audit. So you can imagine, as well as being more complex, it's getting more intrusive. Other areas around here, just to sort of labour this point slightly, shareholders, as in owners of businesses, are now taking more and more interest in what firms are doing. Before they was, running a business, if you're a shareholder, you took your £5 dividend per year and just didn't really worry about it now. But now shareholders are being much more sort of active. I've even heard the phrase punk. For those who remember the 70s, punk investment, trying to actually change the way organisations are actually being run by, trying to make them green, trying to make them more environmentally friendly, trying to make them nicer places to work. And also, that's involved, obviously, in some cases, shareholders actually taking an active role by putting their own directors on the boards to actually help run the firms. And last but almost least, customers. We've often, when we tend to talk about certain, it's very easy when you get talking about complexity, is to be very navel gazing and looking inwards. But you forget we're all here to serve some sort of customer. Whether that customer is an investment partner who you want to sell some investment products to, or the other charitable I do, gambling addicts we're trying to help through their addiction, or performing arts for Black, Asian and minority ethnics in West London. We have some sort of customers who want to take an interest in the way we operate. And basically they're very intrusive. They want to know what's going on, and they've also always got an opinion. And as well as there's various other stakeholders that also take an interest. We've all worked with teams where we've got staff. They need to be looked after. Suppliers, while in theory the suppliers are here to serve the customer, but in a strange way, suppliers can actually be very dominating and lead you. You want to look after the local environment. I remember I did a outsourcing project in a small area on the west side of London. And when we shut the firm down, they were actually the biggest employer in the town. and we got a very large amount of negative press, verbally and written, about shutting down the business and what we were actually doing to the local environment. You know, shops had to close down, cafes were losing all their business. So therefore, you know, again, that was complexity which me as a project manager should have picked up, and I didn't. And effectively around industry peers, you know, we've all got different peers in the industry we want to work with, and you know, and a lot of industries work together as a collective. So what I've done there for the last 5 minutes is sort of talk through all the complexity around organisations, almost like as a sort of like baseline to sort of lead into why sort of like, you know, lots of governance or some sort of governance constructs around to sort of govern those organisations. So therefore, the obvious thing is, if you can imagine these organisations with like a patchwork quilt or a sort of like spaghetti or a furball of complexity that they need to be managed. The key thing is, I mean, a number of areas on this. The first thing there is around the sort of complexity, is that firms need to be able to manage this complexity without breaking or diverting them away from their strategic direction. So just to give a few very high level examples, again, I work for 2 charity organisations. One of those firms is to help around providing gambling awareness, addiction. So, you know, we speak to schools, prisons, housing associations, where we talk about do we think, basically we're saying to these people, if you're having these certain sort of urges and these certain sort of feelings, you may have a gambling problem, to put it bluntly, and if you do, please ring this number, Gambling Anonymous, and all the other health groups who can help you through it. But with all the complexity we have around regulation and funding, it's very easy to actually lose the point of what you're actually doing. You end up so much trying to run the company internally, you don't actually forget your strategic direction, i.e., are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? I mean, at a more detailed level, you know, this complexity is hard to run on a day-to-day basis. If you've got complex legal arrangements, you've got complex technology infrastructures, if you've got demanding clients, you've got strong regulation, or you've got a business that's spread around 4,000 offices dotted around the globe, different time zones, different languages, it's hard to run. But then again, you know, you've got nothing else but to do it because it's essential. And the other area around managing the proactive around that is, I've called it sober, I'll slur that again, which is quite ironic, sober decision making. When firms have every day they're making decisions that can be at a very high level, whether it's a strategic decision to fund a new project or close a project or open an office or to, you know, to run some sort of like new service, and that can go all the way down to very, very on the ground type decisions around you know, can we give somebody an extra couple of days holiday? You know, who's going to be on call over Christmas? What are we going to do next year if there's another lockdown or there's a semi-lockdown of COVID-19? And what happens if we find there's a COVID-22 appears along the door and stuff like that? So, you know, and the challenge around decision making often is you need to often find out what the decision is that needs to be made, which is not easy, often easier said than done. And then you need to go through to understand what data is required to make the decisions. More importantly, what data is missing, and involve all the parties that need to be involved. You know, that can be, you know, external regulators, or it could be suppliers, it could be customers, as well as a host of internal people. And the other thing is who can make the decision. Again, it's, you know, big organisations, there's committee after committee that the decisions are made at the right level. And the last point there, which is, again, I'll talk about this a bit later on, and it's not just a technology thing, is what I've said, is there a clear audit of decision making? You know, when you make any decision, there's lots of inputs into the decision, you know, data and suggestions and assumptions, and then there needs to be various review sessions, and then the actual decision gets made at, you know, whatever level it needs to be made. Just for audit and to cover your backside, to put it bluntly, you need to have a clear audit of the decision making. So again, you can see there's a number of key areas here that are required to manage the complexity. And ultimately, what you want to do with the managers' complexities, there's 2 things, or there's actually 1 thing, but I've wrote it down twice. The whole thing you need to do is trying to manage organisations, to manage this complexity within organisations. You need to ensure that you're still running the organisation for the advantages of its stakeholders. Again, simple example, shareholders. If you've got a firm that you're running, it's got a number of different shareholders, you need to ensure that they get the return they want. You need to run the business to ensure that staff are looked after. Are they getting trained? Are they being looked after? If there's health and safety, if there's COVID and there's other issues, staff working shifts and things like that, need to look after them. You need to look after your suppliers. It's very easy to have an attitude of going criticising and bashing your suppliers to get every penny out of them. But on the end, you want your suppliers to still do a good job for you, so you have to be a good customer. You need to look after your customers as well. Ultimately, whether these customers are paying customers, like people buying a ticket to go and see a concert, or they are gambling addicts or a student at a university, you need to look after them. The other thing you need to look after the local environments. I gave that example earlier on where I did an offshoring/outsourcing project, and everything got moved offshore, and it was the actual biggest employer in that town, and lost a lot of other firms which we were quite ignorant of in a bad way, shut down. You want to make sure your industry peers are happy. Obviously, you don't want to be an outlier or try and be a black sheep in the industry by doing something very naughty, and that causes problems with it. That brings the whole industry down, which happened in banking. 2 or 3 banks behaved very, very poorly, and the whole industry is got a very bad name. Regulators or lawmakers or legislations, everything is governed by laws these days. So therefore, you need to, if you're doing stuff, you need to keep the regulators happy. Or in other words, I've put down there, governance needs to manage the organisation complexity. Or in other words, are you, apart from managing the organisations for the advantage of the stakeholders, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? So if you're a charity and you're looking after people, are you looking after those people? If you're an investment firm selling tax efficient products, are you still doing that? If you're a university and you're doing online learning, are you still doing that? So that's why we actually need to proactively manage the governance around there. So I'm just going to take a sip of water, but I don't know if Antonio, for some reason, the list of the chat box hasn't appeared. I don't know if there's any questions at all. So
no questions so far. Thank you, Paul.
That's fine. That's a segue to have a drink, so thanks. Okay, so what I've done there is I've talked in a lot of depth and probably quite dully, so I do apologise, around the complexity of organisations and why this complexity needs to be managed. It's effectively a fact of life. And therefore, the tool that a lot of firms use now is something called governance to try and manage that. I think before we sort of dive into governance, I think you need to, as most people are aware, that governance over the years often receives a large amount of bad press, where you have it's deceived as sort of like busybodies going around sticking their nose in and not adding any real value, lots of jobs worths, walking around with clipboards, long and endless, laborious, pointless forms that seem to take months and, well, not months, but hours and hours to fill in with no real benefit, and even long and more pointless meetings. But while that sort of caricature of governance is completely true, I would sort of stress that proper governance is not like that at all. So I think for those of a certain age, and I know a few of you, looking at your ages, you're a certain age, you may remember a brilliant show from the 70s and the 80s in the UK called Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister. Highly recommend anybody who hasn't seen it to watch it. And there was a character in there, which that's Gerard Scarfe picture of, actually, of course, Sir Humphrey Appleby, who was the head of the British Civil Service. And he was a real bureaucrat and used administration and governance effectively to do nothing. In fact, I think the phrase they used, it was creative inertia, not to do anything. And they came up with some of these some of these great phrases. Red tape is fun, red tape holds the country together, and administration saves the nation. And that was a shame, really, because it gave such a bad impression of sort of governance and oversight type stuff that it's probably taken 30 years for it to actually rub off. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that governance does really, really, really get a bad press, but if it's done well, it's actually there to protect everyone. Just recap it quickly. We've gone through organisations and had a lot of discussion about how complex they are and the importance that this complexity needs to be managed. and the key tool or the key weapon to manage that is governance. And we sort of take a look at that. Governance does get actually a bit of a bad press. But now let's actually talk about what actually is governance. Again, it's sort of slightly repeating what we've done before. It's basically insurance or ensuring that organisations are being run for the advantages of stakeholders, or again, doing what they're supposed to be doing. So not wanting to sort of repeat myself, if you're a charity, you're ensuring that you're actually doing your charitable cause. If you're an oil and gas company, you're actually providing the oil and the gas that clients need. If you're a university, you're actually providing the courses and teaching that university. And obviously, it's, again, just going through those stakeholders again. I know we've covered that on the previous slide, so I won't go through that again. So therefore, what actually governance is and obviously ensuring that organisations are being run or doing what they're supposed to be doing. But to ensure that happens, it's implementing, suitable controls, structures, which can be like reports and data, committees that are in place to manage the complexity. And I always tend to look at around in 4 main areas. The first one is having suitable controls, structures, committees, etc., to ensure that the strategic direction is still being followed. So worst comes to worst, you might have to change it, but make sure you're following it. The second one is to manage what I call current problems, which is probably like a sadistic way of saying manage the business on a day-to-day basis. The area also is around governance is always future looking. That future looking can be anything from 3 months into the future to 5 years in the future, if not longer. And the other area, which again is always forgotten, and I must be a bit of a passionate person around this, is around decision making, ensuring there's suitable controls, structures and committees in place around decision making. So that will sort of lead us on nicely into what I've called the 4 elements of governance. And I've got a rather sort of like NAF diagram here on the right that talks through those. And you can see, and almost slightly repeating, but a bit more detail what we discussed before. So again, the first point there is remembering your strategic direction, which will obviously support the business growth, underpin day-to-day running, as well as doing anything like changing the business going forward. So it's very important that you have governance structures in place, reporting in place, that can actually basically ensure that a firm is doing what its long-term strategic objectives are, and if that firm is moving away from those objectives, to understand why, and you can change objectives because the world's changing, or change your behaviour to follow those objectives. The second area is around managing current problems. Again, I've got a few more slides on this bit later on, and which is technology colleagues I've worked with, and been a technologist myself for many years, is day-to-day problems of technology are actually unbelievably hard and stressful. Anything from somebody forgetting their password to a major system outage that's caused all sorts of problems. The next area here is around proactively managing for future problems, or maybe just proactively managing for the future. Actually, maybe problems is a little bit rude. Again, more detail later in the pack on that, but there's anything managing from how do we get over the Christmas period, or how do we get through to Easter in case COVID happens, all the way to is how do we ensure that we're going to sort of like ensure everything's in place for the long-term strategy. And the other area around here is around clear decision making, and that can be anything from within the technology groups, where technology have to make decisions every single day on what they need to do, from managing implementations of projects to capacity planning to catalogue management, as well as part of the wider business organisation. And one other point I've put right down the bottom here in the bottom left hand corner is very much around goes on to the previous slide about governance gets a bad press. I think the key point to remember is that you could have an issue where you have an organisation or a technology system or infrastructure or technology department where you have too much governance, and this is where people get the impression of red tape, pointless forms, horrible jobs worths, what have you, where it almost seems the governance is so heavy doesn't actually seem to be doing anything at all. It doesn't seem to be controlling direction or helping problems or helping to manage the future. It just seems to be completing the forms for the point of it. But alternatively, and I personally feel it's far more common, is where organisations have too little governance over what they're doing. For example, they don't have enough governance around to ensure that they're managing for the future. They don't track their strategic direction. And then the issue with that is it was almost the opposite. You know, firms don't know what's going wrong. They don't know where they're going off the steer, and then basically will go on running for months and months and months, years, even longer than that. And they suddenly realise, you know, they haven't planned for the future. They're not, the strategic directions all over the place, and it causes a lot of problems. But again, I've got a slide with much more of a technology slant on that a bit later on. Right. I can. Hi.
Yeah.
Go.
We
have
one
to ask
question.
I saw another thing flash up. Sorry.
Brilliant. We have a question from Stephen. He's asking about if we are going to talk about culture as something that requires management. I don't know if I understood your question correctly. I think that nowadays, we can see that company culture has a quite strong component in the business life. So I think around culture, I agree with you. That is something that does need management and nurturing or unnurturing, as the case may be. I mean, if I just go back to the diagram here, whoops, let me just scroll back. I think as an culture is always an interesting thing, because people say firms have a bad culture or they have a good culture. To me, a culture is a culture. You know, I mean, it just reflects the reality of the world. So what will happen is the way I've done in the past. I think when you start managing your staff through the various areas I've got on here, like the future planning, clear decision making, one of the things, as you develop your staff for that, is you develop what I call hard skills. If you're a technologist, you learn to program in COBOL or Fortran, as I was when I was growing up, as well as other things. But also you need a lot of soft skills around how to deal with conflict. But I think also what you need, almost like an umbrella over everything, is the way the glue of the organisation. And you do need to sort of manage the way the organisation works, the way the people speak, and that's almost like, I think, the way the culture can be managed. I think also culture is quite key under the strategic objectives. I think one of the reasons a lot of firms struggle with cultural wise is they don't really know which way the organisation's going. So if you have an organisation that is, for example, picking an airline I don't want to mention the name because I don't want to get in trouble, whose whole attitude is have the lowest fees on the planes, and they will go out and set very aggressive. Their whole having worked with people there, their whole internal culture is around being the cheapest, so that everything they want to do is cheap. If you put £2 on something, that could be that's eaten into their margin. I've also worked at an investment manager who again, I can't say who they are, but you can see on my LinkedIn, who charged the lowest fees in America and charged the lowest fees in the UK when it comes to fees, and they are really, really low. But so their whole culture is giving the best customer service at a very, very they call it reasonable, but everybody else calls them cheap. So the whole culture around there is what allows that culture to work quite well, both in the airline and the investment firm, is everybody's 100% clear on what the organisation's strategic direction is. So it's very, so everybody just follows it. Everybody's got clear. I like your point about, Stephen, about risk management. I think culture influences everything, but risk is an interesting point because I've worked at a number of firms over the years, and I'm sure everybody here has worked at some of the firms, where some firms are so risk adverse. They won't take any what I call any risk at all. Everything is mitigated to the point of extreme, even to the point they won't actually do things. It's too risky. And I think also other firms, banks as well, actually going back 10, 15 years, I wouldn't even say they were risk averse. I think they were risk blind. They didn't even know what their risks were, which is why you had these massive amounts of issues when the credit crunch happened. So I agree with culture. I think culture, I agree that culture is risk management. And inaction is right, is also risky. I think
I think one of the there is actually a slide on sort of like managing issues and risks going on. I think the issue with risks is that firms need to monitor their risks on a regular basis. You know, have a risk register and make it a real risk register, actual real thing, as opposed to pointless things just there to sort of play party politics. And on this, having this risk register review on a regular basis, you know, it could be monthly, it could be weekly, quarterly, and then just to understand what the risks are. I think it may be a case of the risk that you take no action at all. You just think, well, we've got the risk mitigated, or it's a fact of life. We just have to go with it. But I think if you're going to be inactive, I think it's being proactive in action as opposed to just not being inactive in action, if you know what I mean. Right, I'm sorry, that was a bit of a waffle, Stephen. I don't know if that answered your question. I mean, feel free to raise any other points or post another message. Okay, so where did we got through that one? And we'll just, what I was going to do now is, I think as you just jump back a bit here, we did the on the right hand side there, I did a very sort of abstract model around sort of the four main bits of governance. I think as this is obviously primarily a sort of like BCS technology group, I thought I would sort of develop that, or I have developed that into a bit more of a technology governance model. So what I've done is literally taken the four blobs there, and then sort of expanded it into eight blobs there around technology. And I've tried to make the model on the right a little bit more sort of like a usable or a pragmatic type model, or a set of guidelines that firms can use on a sort of as and when they need to. And obviously you're more than welcome to borrow this as to your heart's content. So again, just to straight the point down here is that in the same way governance on an organizational level is ensuring that the organization is supporting its stakeholders or doing what it's supposed to be doing, you can almost sort of like plagiarize that from a technology point of view to say this is, you know, technology governance ensuring that technology is supporting the business as it needs to be supported, or is actually doing what technology is supposed to be doing. So it's a very sort of similar sort of like a sort of like thought process. So again, I'll take it from the top, literally at 12 o'clock, and I'll work my way around. I think the key thing is, again, probably slightly repeating myself before, is around the first thing is technology needs to understand what its purpose is within the business. And what function it does. Some functions are for many years, technology has always seemed like dragging behind the business. You know, they were providing accounting systems or ordering systems or payroll systems or HR systems. But now in certain firms, you know, digital firms, website firms, online firms, technology is almost the front of the business now. So in a strange way, a lot of firms like to think they're technology led. Some of that is PR, I'm going to say to you, but some of them really are. So really technology needs to understand where it fits in with the overall organizational strategy. And as part of that, you can also determine, you know, what happens if the technology fails. This is quite important because it will actually shape what sort of performance monitoring that is required. And if you can see the blob, sort of like 3:30, it's around performance monitoring. And depending on, once you understand the importance of technology, you know, you can understand what's critical and what's not critical. So, for example, you may have a technology online platform that does all your orders, like an online bookstore. If that platform goes down or the website goes down, your business is shut. So that is super critical, and therefore we need lots of monitoring and a lot of controls around. But if you're another firm who's just got a very small website with a few online brochures, if that goes down, it's probably not the end of the world. It can probably cope for a day without it. So while it still has controls around it, they're probably not so aggressively. And normally most oversight and technology will have a series of forums to run it. Typically what you always need is some sort of very senior management forum that can, you know, often that's some sort of like an executive committee, maybe under the board, that runs technology on a regular basis and makes sure that everything's going well, and have representation across the business. And you could have also around a number of change boards, you know, change request boards, managing changes, going through long term, release planning, operational boards. And the other thing is, actually, I noticed 2 or 3 firms doing it. It does seem a bit odd, and one would argue it could be sort of jumping on the bandwagon. I've got a number of clients I've been working with, well, I've worked with anyway, in oversight, who are actually now having committees and oversight at a very senior level to ensure that their computing infrastructure is as green as it can be to combat climate change. Half of me thinks it's greenwashing to trying to be seen to do the right things, but half of me honestly thinks a lot of firms are now taking this very, very seriously. Once you've got the objectives sorted out, the key thing is around ownership. Governance is, you need somebody to blame if it goes wrong, or you need somebody to get a bonus if it goes well, to put it bluntly. So each individual element of the technology infrastructure needs an owner allocated to it. So, for example, the way I've described it here, technically you should have two owners, really. You should have a technology owner and a business owner. So if you're looking at a technology infrastructure, for example, I was working at an investment supermarket previously. The front end of that was a very, very sophisticated website to open accounts, perform trades, close trades, move cash around. And they had a business owner who was effectively head of client sales, to be honest with you, but also had a technology owner who was like the head of the development team for that area. So they have joint ownership, but you will end up with certain areas owned just by technology. For example, the infrastructure and some of the other stuff. This is actually quite important now. As I mentioned earlier, certain industries and financial services where I've been working on are required by law for certain areas of business to have named owners, which are actually sent to the regulator. And these named owners will get a knock on the front door if things go wrong. So this area of ownership is very, very important. The actual ownership on a day-to-day basis can be split into two levels. At a senior level, there will be like a forum that could own the elements of technology. I sort of mentioned that on the previous slide. But on a sort of pragmatic level, on a day-to-day basis, there could be a number of working groups and owners who own the elements on an operational level. Now, for example, you could have a daily stand-up meeting that looks after supporting a technology system, or you can have regular meetings with suppliers to track outsourced providers. So working our way around, I'm actually going to, as you probably noticed, I've just skipped performance measurement, mainly because I think when I was doing a sort of dry run of this earlier in the week, I think that it seemed better to have performance measurement at the end. So what I'm going to mention is the next items around managing current problems. I mean, we've all got a background in technology, and no matter how hard you work, how thorough you are, you'll have problems on a day-to-day basis, and that can be anything from somebody forgetting their username or forgetting their password, or a printer getting jammed or can't connect to a printer, which are normally quite easily fixed because you can put a procedure in place. But also day-to-day problems can be a major issue. You could have a major system failure, a component could crash, an enterprise data bus could not work, a database could lose a certificate, sorry, not a certificate, it could lose its license. So that could, and these things need to be fixed pretty quickly. So therefore, what firms really need in place on a day-to-day basis is some sort of like triage function that will quickly, and I mean quickly, often within minutes, analyze critical problems and to determine what they are. And how to work around them. So that could be anything around implementing a workaround, installing emergency fixes, or for some of the easier stuff like usernames and passwords, have sort of off-the-shelf, maybe self-service functions to do it. Again, sort of scrolling around again, as well as managing current problems, ownership, and the objectives, you need to manage the short-term future. And I've deliberately split this away from long-term planning. So short-term future, I would probably say, is from tomorrow for about a rolling 6 months, is to ensure that the short-term future is looking after. And this comes down to the point Stephen mentioned in this, which he sort of highlighted, and perhaps if I ever do this presentation again, I'll probably highlight risk a bit more, is that basically what it is trying to do is having a look at things that could happen or things that could go wrong in the next 6 months. Some of those things could be easily managed around, like Christmas holiday, putting scenarios in around for COVID-19. but there could be other issues that are slightly less understood that could happen. So you may want to have think about what is the risk that if one of our major suppliers fails, what do we do? What is the risk if one of our customers fails? What is the risk? And therefore you need to sort of work through these risks and have some sort of like scenario plans and some ideas and mitigations. You might have like 4 or 5 different plans for one risk, depending on what happens. The internal risks tend to be easier in a strange way because, if you've got problems with single points of failure, there is a risk that if one person disappears, then you will struggle. You can actually you can recruit somebody or cross-train one. The external risks are much more challenging, because you may have no idea that suppliers are about to go bankrupt. You may have no idea no one had any idea that COVID-19 was coming over, or you had no idea what Brexit was going to look like, even probably 3 days before Brexit happened. So those external risks are much more challenging. But you still need to sort of like manage for them and have risk managements and mitigations in place. And I mentioned down there the very final point, once a risk has been reviewed and understood and mitigated, it's not a case of just put it on a spreadsheet and forget about these. You need to monitor these on a regular basis. I remember when I was doing Brexit work, about this time last year, I guess, one of my clients was probably the most risk-averse people you've ever met, and they wanted to review the Brexit risk log every 48 hours. So we literally had all sat down and went round the thing, went down the Brexit log, 48 hours, came back and said nothing's changed. But the problem, what the good thing was, when it did change, and it moved quite quickly in December, we had the structures and the mindset in place. So it's very important that you look forward and think out what could go wrong and make sure that you actually fix it, or not fix it, but be ready to fix it. Change management, and this is probably the title of millions and millions of books out there at the moment. As everybody's aware, organisations are complex, technology infrastructures with different pieces of software, suppliers, interactions, everything dotted across the various clouds, in-house packages, out-house packages, COBOL packages, Java packages. It's incredibly complicated, and making change to that is surprisingly hard. You can do one change and it could input downstream very quickly. Using a very simple example, an area I was working about 3 or 4 years ago, somebody made a minor change into some front-end messaging on the trading system, and it caused 21 million errors over 3 years downstream that weren't picked up to about 4 years later, until the regulator said, this doesn't look right, and cue lots of panic and running around. And it was a very minor change, and no one had any idea, obviously, that this minor change up the front would impact 25 components downstream, something that happened. So it's very key that you have very much, when you do changes, around testing, impact analysis, and general awareness, so everybody knows if a change is going in there, understand, this could go in and it could impact them, so aware of this. And these changes can range from immediate changes, where you've got a major problem that needs to be fixed, which is what the messaging problem was, to large complex changes requiring weekends to implement, major hardware upgrade or major software upgrade or migration from one platform to another. And these all changes, and again, this is another area that when I've worked, and especially some of the smaller firms, they don't really have a very good rollback process. It's almost a case they pull it in. If it don't work, they hack it out. So therefore, firms need to have very, very strong governance around the processes in place to allow changes to be made to ensure that it doesn't cause an unnecessary ripple effect down the stream. Then moving on to future planning. Where the one down at sort of like 7:30 relates to short-term managing short-term planning, which I think I said is like from tomorrow to 6 months. The long-term planning is very much sort of like 6 months onwards, and it's very much what people academia will call it strategic planning or long-term planning. And I think technology is often an area that's often forgotten about when doing long-term planning, because it's often seen as a sort of a back-end system. But as we all know now, a lot of firms are very reliant on technology, and in fact are driven by technology. So therefore, when I sort of speak with clients about the sort of planning they need to do for their strategies, the first one is you will have changes that you need to make that are driven by the business strategy. The business might have an activity around growth, maybe to double the number of clients or the number of courses they run over 18 months. And therefore, you need to understand, well, if they double the number of clients, or they double the number of courses that are running, or they double the number of online inquiries, then what changes to the technology systems do we need to make to cope with that? Do we need to upgrade bandwidth? Do we need to implement new systems? Do we need to recruit more people? So that's almost a case of, technology follows or is dragged forward by the business strategy. The next one is around, and this is a key one, it's often get forgotten, but there's certain firms who are on the forefront of these things actually do it, is technology can actually help drive the business strategy. There's reading some of the stuff on IT Now and the other on the online IT Now and the glossy brochure one. There's some fantastic articles around big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence. And for those going back many years, when it was just basically artificial intelligence was just loads of if then else loops that go on and on and on. But now there is some general intelligence and machine learning, and some of the stuff comes out of machine learning is so insightful. So now technology really has the ability to drive the business strategy. And one of my other clients I work with is another financial services firm. We're actually using machine learning techniques to try and determine the best way to trade certain assets in the markets. Do we trade them in the morning? Do we trade them in the afternoon? Do we trade them on bank holidays and Saturdays, to try and work out the time they get the best price? And what they're actually trying to do is develop these algorithms or machine learning algorithms, which can actually then help drive the business strategy, because they can say we can come up with better ways of doing the business. And there's obviously great examples also with things like Amazon and with all their websites and what have you. And likewise, technology within itself needs to have its own strategy. I've worked over the years. There is a habit of not retiring or consolidating of applications. You just add a new thing on the side, which is fine when you've got 4 things. But over 20 or 30 years, maybe not 20 or 15 years, I meant to say, you suddenly get a very, very complex set of applications, and it becomes unmanageable. So technology itself might want to do things like, well, we want to consolidate this application. We want to remove this application because it will reduce costs and reduce risks. We want to make sure all our staff are trained, plus many others. I mean, obviously, one of the key ones at the moment is migrating data centers onto the cloud. Although that's not as far harder to do than actually as it says. So if you can imagine from a sort of long-term planning, technology needs to be driven by the business, because obviously we're here to serve the business or a business. Technology can actually also help drive the business strategy, because these great new inventions, especially around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing, can really, really drive the business. But also technology has to have its own little strategy within itself, which is really to try and keep its own house in order. And then we're just going to sort of jump back slightly out of order, because I thought it read better, is performance measures. So ultimately, if you think about it, when you've got all your governance structures and constructs and committees in place, you'll be managing the objective why technology exists, making sure you've got clear roles and responsibilities, putting structures in place to manage current problems, managing the next 6 months, making sure changes are done, and obviously making sure the long-term planning is done. And that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. It's no means, even for the smallest organisation, there's a lot of stuff there that needs to be done to make sure the technology infrastructures are managed. And really, you need to say away how well or not are we doing it. So you need some way of sort of measuring your performance. And that could be anything, for example, managing current problems. You could have a series of statistics or measures that says how many problems have we having per day? Are we fixing them? How many, strange one is how many people forgetting their passwords? Anything from that, how many major significant issues have we had? And you can measure all of those. So therefore, you need some way of sort of like, I've called them key performance indicators, KPIs. They need to be sort of defined to allow performance to be monitored. And I think the challenge with KPIs is, and I haven't got it on the slide here, actually, I sort of remembered it when I was chatting, is that you need, I think what statisticians call validity, and it's ensuring the KPI you're trying to use actually measures what you're trying to measure. You can actually have 1,000 KPIs across anything, and they're all pointless. I remember when I still worked for the OU, and I remember I went into a class and I rang up, somebody said, do I have enough desks for the number of students coming in? And the guy came back and said, I've got 10 desks. I said, well, that's not very helpful. If I've got 11 students, that's not very good. So basically the KPI he had was, how many desks are there? The KPI I wanted to know, did I have enough desks for my students? And so basically that's a simple example. And also the other area around is the frequency of the KPI. I know certain KPIs, if they're automated, like problems with software errors or performance on the network or the number of rejected timeouts on a website or something like that, they can be easily reported on because a report or some sort of extract can be done. But other KPIs, say around, I can't think, like the change errors or something like that, can be quite manual and cumbersome to pull together. So it's important that the KPI, how frequently you report them, because you don't want to be in a position where you're having a KPI every week and it actually takes a week to collate the KPI. I mean, it becomes slightly pointless. So you need somewhere in between. And the thing about the KPIs and the performance measurement, if the performance is poor, or you can actually take corrective action. And in fact, I've been in places where the performance have been so good, they've actually made the KPIs harder because they probably said the KPIs must have been very laxed. And two other points. I see there's a few questions, well, 3 questions popping up. Let me, if you can bear with me to do 2 other points. I think the first one is to manage governance of an organisation, you need timely and accurate data. And I've given a couple of examples there. If you're trying to manage support issues, you need to know how many support issues are, what's causing them, are there any trends? If you're doing changes, you need to have an understanding of all the changes being made and obviously planning for futures. And the other thing around the timely and accurate data is good communication. There's a great phrase I learned many years ago: communications in the ear of the receiver. So you can tell somebody something, but if that person doesn't hear what you wanted to say, it hasn't been communicated. And so the key point there is to ensure that the communication matches the person who's hearing it. So what you tend to find is a very, very simple example. If you're going to a very senior management, they probably just want to know what's gone wrong. And if it's not, and I don't really care otherwise. Support staff are much more on the ground, and they want to, no doubt, and developers and accountants, they want much more detail. And the other point, which I've sort of discussed 2 or 3 times, I do want to sort of stress it because I do feel quite passionate about this one, is that having the right amount of governance and control is very, very important. If you've got too much governance, or it's too heavy, as I use a horrible phrase there, then it will be perceived as red tape. It will be ignored or not followed or even ridiculed. So therefore, if it's not followed or ignored, then issues will be missed, and it's actually pointless. And you get to point you're wasting all your time not even doing it. And if the governance is too light, you don't do any governance at one extreme or very minimal, issues could be missed, which could mean something very small. So, for example, you may have an ongoing problem on a day-to-day that's not being escalated or trapped. That small problem can escalate easily out of control and cause many problems. And if governance is too light, it's clearly not fit for purpose. So therefore, as well as obviously implementing governance and all based on the 7 snooker balls, I guess what they are, the blue snooker balls on the right, you need to ensure that firms constantly review the governance in place on a regular basis. And in fact, I've just finished a project, a firm or an organisation, to be more precise, who we've actually just gone through and sort of redesigned a lot of their board reporting, because the challenge they had was the boards were getting about anywhere between 200 and 250 pages worth of reports to read as a board meeting. Which probably it's like every board meeting trying to read a book size of Lord of the Rings before going in and thoroughly understanding it. And we've tried to compress the whole thing down to about 30 pages, which we haven't done yet, but it's a lot nearer 30 pages than a Lord of the Rings every time. Okay, so that's what brings me to the bulk of the discussion. I don't know if Antonio, I see a few things flashing up. I purposely ignore them. Apologies, but I thought we'd catch them all together at the end.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, let's just go for a minute. All right, I've got Stephen. I agree. A single point of failure is a risk that needs close. Yeah, that I completely agree with that. Yeah, I remember years ago when I started out, and there were small firms, organisations with 30 people. And Fred was the person who did everything on technology. If Fred was on holiday or Fred had gone to the bathroom, the whole of the company came to a grinding halt. Right, Stephen again. Second point. Even seemingly trivial stuff like MS end of life or OS can damage strategies based on the current. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I've tried when I've worked I haven't done a pure IT project for a year or so now, but I remember I worked at a part of the UK government regulator, and we were trying to do a major upgrade to Unix as it was, and trying to explain how complex that was and how expensive it was and how much time has been planned for. That it was very frustrating trying to explain it to our seniors who just didn't understand it. They just thought you just put a CD-ROM in and press the button. PM first needs a performance management first needs an understanding the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, which inform what key success indicators. Yep, agree. So I think effectiveness is ensuring you're trying to do it as best as you can. Efficiently is trying to do it as quickly as you can. So if you do one without the other, you could cause lots of problems. So the idea is, I think, Stephen, this is a fantastic point. You need to do the both together. Yeah. Excellent. I can't see other questions, Antonio. Can you? I've only got one screen at the moment. I'm trying to juggle.
Yeah, no, that's all that we have right now.
Okay. Okay. So we're almost there now. I hear you shout hooray. I'm going to go and watch the jungle later. So just to run through where we are, so just to do a quick summarise. Governance essentially is ensuring that organisations are being run for the advantages of their stakeholders, and that could be anything from shareholders to customers to the local environment, etc. Or, as I like to call it, is ensuring organisations do what they're supposed to be doing. So again, I always use the example of a charitable cause. The idea of a charity is to look after the charitable cause, which in the case of the two I look after, one of them is working with people to ensure they don't become gambling addicts. And it's very easy with a lot of complexity. You can lose your mind. I've gone through a sort of like a snooker ball diagram that lists a number of key elements of technology governance: understanding the objective, having clear roles, managing current problems, managing the short-term, change management, long-term planning, performance measurement, which I think is a very key one, and plus ensuring there's effective communication. I think they're the main areas. Secondly, you need to ensure that there is not a suitable level of governance. If you have too much governance, it becomes red tape, boredom, and just general people lose interest, which is no good because it doesn't work. Or if you do too little, you're probably not checking as much as you should be checking, or not controlling, and there's always a chance things could go wrong. And most importantly is to review governance structures in place as organisations grow or change. So what you would find is a very small firm, when they first start out, would actually have very light governance because there's not much to govern really. But as that firm grows, especially if it acquires other firms or spreads offices, firms need to review their governance structure to match their growth. And the example I gave of that board paper, Lord of the Rings versus 30 odd pages, is actually a good example of that. The firm grew and grew and grew, and the governance got bigger and bigger and bigger, where actually, if anything, it needed to actually slim down somewhat thing. Okay, that's what brings us to the end. So I hope you found that useful and as much as and enjoyable as much as I enjoy speaking about it. Thanks for all the questions. I hope I answered those. But obviously, if you want to discuss any of the points raised, you've got my email address there, my Twitter handle, I think it's called, is there, and also my LinkedIn there.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that we'll be concluding the event for tonight. That is our last event of the year. So we will welcome you soon once again in 2022. Thank you very much, and have everybody a good nice rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye now.